Right. Good morning, everybody. We're Friday, the 24th of March, 2023, and this is episode 88. What is also, interestingly, is the first episode of the fourth year of retuning, because we actually started around about the 20th of March, going way back just before lockdown. Seems a long, long time ago, and yet we're still here talking about retuning your firm. And I suspect we'll be continuing to retune our firms for the foreseeable future, quite frankly, with what's going on at the moment in the outside world. Today, we're talking about creating and sustaining an adaptive culture. And one of the groups that the Managing Partners Forum organises is called People, Performance and Culture. And people say, what's all that about? I said, well, the people agenda is actually fundamentally about culture. So what we're going to be talking about today, as you'll see from the three little images in front of you, are culture, implementation, and perhaps most importantly of all, adaptive. So I'm Richard Chaplin, and thanks again for joining us on actually it's quite a nice sunny day out here in East Herts, but no doubt it's wonderful with you wherever you are based. And what I'm going to do today is just, before we start talking about introducing our guests and our co-host Francesca, is just going to talk you through quickly what's today's theme all about. Well, when we think about top knowledge intensive firms, and that could be in any sector, it could be a big four, it could be a major law firm, it could be a McKenzie, is that they can often, the top ones, select people who are hungry to learn and grow. And then they actually give them suitable systems and workflow to support them. They also adopt a very systemic approach to skills development, where loads of people get together, including learning development, practice group leaders, mentors, coaches, and others, to help fill gaps and reinforce progress. But what's interesting is a lot of people think, gosh, that must be really, really expensive. Actually, it doesn't cost any more money. It's just a different mindset and a different set of practices. And it requires a collaborative approach, which possibly is missing from some of the professional firms we know. So what are we doing on episode 88? I'm going to be welcoming two guests, McKenzie, who is the Chief People Officer of a top 20 accountancy firm, and Pauline Caldwell, who was formerly the HR director of Clyde & Co., which is obviously a major international law firm, now runs her own successful business, and you'll get to meet her very soon. One thing that our two guests have in common is they both come from Scotland. So there you go. We'll talk a bit more about that, I'm sure, as well. And what they're going to be doing is sharing some tips on how management teams in more or less any profession can gain competitive advantage through creating and sustaining an adaptive culture. Before we go on to actually meeting them, a little bit of information about the forum news. There's actually quite a lot happening at the moment. The new search engine I've mentioned to you is we're looking to pilot it next month. So that's quite exciting. And you'll be able to actually find the videos and watch them. We're getting a lot of social media hits on those because we're kind of using some of the really lovely 5-minute slots from the past and bringing them back to life in social media at the moment in LinkedIn. Mentor Match, again, continues to thrive. And that's quite important because, as I mentioned a minute or so ago, mentors are a very key part of that group of people who help people grow their assets, grow their skills and develop. And the quarterly tracker, that's actually going to be open today, in fact, for the next couple of weeks. And get in touch, please, if you're interested in joining the research panel. It's currently 95 firms, but we'd love to get it a few more. And that's really interesting. And the last one I wanted to mention, and you will hear about this if you are a forum member or in a firm-wide leader role, is that we've been working for about 6 months now on a leadership development program for firm-wide leaders. And it's built around one very key issue, which I suspect we've even touched on today, which I would loosely refer to as building consensus. And we've seen that as being a very key attribute of successful leaders in our sector. And the areas that we're looking at under that building consensus are self-awareness, in other words, EQ, having a vision, shifting to a more collaborative culture, enhancing relationships, digital transformation, and then working with the IOD, a board simulation. So there's some quite interesting things that the forum's about to launch. So kind of watch this space on that one, I think. That's probably about enough from me, I think, for the moment. So I'm now going to hand you over, if I may, to our amazing co-host, Francesca Lagerberg, who, as I think I will tell everybody today, I usually forget, is the global CEO of Baker Tilly International. So welcome to today's show, Francesca. And I'm now going to invite you to introduce our guests. Over to you.
Thank you, Richard. I'm relieved to see you got back from Poland yesterday with all the events you've had going on there. And we've got a fabulous panel today. We're going to really delve into some of the intricacies of creating an adaptive culture, which sounds super easy on paper and is very difficult in practice. So we're going to kick off with Pauline Caldwell, as you've heard, previous experience in a very large legal firm, and now has her own business, Momentum Business. She's also an executive coach, and she has a couple of non-exec roles, including her first foray into financial services with the Cambridge Building Society. And we always ask our guests to share something that we might not find out about them on LinkedIn. So think about Pauline tomorrow when she's off with her siblings on a family trip to Dubai, recreating their childhoods, going there with her brother and her sister. That sounds like an amazing trip. So Pauline, take us through your thoughts on an adaptive culture and how we can learn from that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Francesca, and great to be here. So looking forward to sharing my pearls of wisdom. As I was kind of preparing for this session, one of the things that was really at the forefront of my mind is the fact that in the news and the press this week, culture is really a hot topic at the moment. The Met Police has just been found to be institutionally racist, sexist, and homophobic. So what I thought I would do is kind of just share my reactions to that against the culture context and what I think we can do, all of us, to create and sustain a positive working culture for the good of all of our stakeholders. And I think what really resonated with me this week, and each morning there's something new coming out, was the recent example of that toxic culture is that the toxic behaviours have been allowed to pervade across that organisation. And I think that's the first thing that really kind of resonated with me. It's the pervasiveness of that toxic behaviour. And then secondly, it was the fact that it's allowed to go unchecked for years, even though there's, the systems that Richard talked about when he was introducing, that there was the systems in place to help manage that and prevent it. But actually the systems themselves were working against the culture of the organisation, or the desired culture of the organisation. And I think that the third element within this that really resonated with me was the fact that it's these challenges, these issues have been brought up within their environment multiple times. So if we think back 20 odd years when there was the terrible situation with Stephen Lawrence, it seems to be, history is repeating itself. So for me, it was almost like, is there willful ignorance here? As in, there's nothing to see here. We like the status quo, so this serves me well. So let's just kind of go on as is. And I think really the bit that really kind of annoys me is it's the tolerance of those toxic behaviours. I think that really resulted in the most series of outcomes for a major organisation, which was the murder of a member of the public. Thankfully, in our organisations and professional services, that's not likely to be any outcome. Nothing ever, hopefully, that severe. But I think the findings of the Met Police is really reflective of our societal challenges, and I think all of our organisations that we work in are a microcosm of society. And the likelihood is that being not trying to have an idealistic approach to this, but the likelihood is this exists everywhere in some form or another, to a greater or lesser degree. But I think for me, and particularly my background with a HR hat on, I think it's about what we choose to do about it. And it really emphasised to me the role that we all play in setting and creating the right culture for the good of our business, our clients, our people, and our broader stakeholders. So I think my first challenge to everybody listening in today is just to really ask yourself the question, how often have you witnessed toxic or poor behaviour and walked away thinking that's someone else's job to fix, or it was in the too difficult box because it was politically sensitive, or there's a bit of a there, but for the grace of God go I. If I challenge this, then they might challenge me in something else further down the line. And I know culture is a huge topic, but I thought we'd try and bring it back to some practical realities, as Richard Richard knows I'm a bit of a practical, pragmatic implementer of stuff. So I thought I'd break it down into kind of three things to share with you today. So at a strategic level, I think as leaders on the boards, as leaders responsible for running the business day to day, I think the question we're going to be asking ourselves is, what do we want our clients, our people, our competitors and our regulators to be saying about our culture? So, when your clients are recommending you, why are they doing that? What is that good stuff that they're talking about? How that is the essence of your culture. The same for your people when they're encouraging their friends or past colleagues, etc., to come and join you. What is it your competitors are saying because they've yet lost out again to a piece of work because you've got the edge over them? And your regulators, actually, you're really not involved with them because you're doing everything right, so they don't have to be. So I think that's the bit at the top level that we need to be thinking about. Then operationally, there's 4 things I've kind of thought. I'm trying to bucket this up. So I think operationally, once you've had that strategic conversation, how do we define that? And then how do we publish that? So I think for me, it's about making sure there's all levels of the organisation are involved in that conversation and involved in that publication of it, whether it be social media, telling the stories, bringing it to life so people really understand what it is. But I think the caution there is just to make sure it's not about really what the leaders think. It's about everyone, because it has to be the real lived experience, not the golden piece over here that we aspire to, but actually day to day we're not living it and breathing it. Which brings me on to my second point under the operational pieces. We have to live by it. So we really have to think about how do we hardwire that culture into our people practices. So when we are hiring people and selecting people, what is the criteria that we want them to be measured against? When we onboard them, how do we reinforce that culture? How do we share with them what good looks like? How do we then re-emphasize that through the performance measures that we assess them against, and then how we reward and we recognize them, so that people understand in your culture there's a consequence of their actions positively and negatively. And then the third element under the operational bit is call it out. So we all have a responsibility when we see something happening and we don't like it and we don't think it's right, call out that poor behaviour. Don't be complicit and walk away, and don't allow other leaders to undermine the good stuff that you're all doing. And then conversely, actually really celebrate when you're seeing it done well and really kind of shining the light on it, and not hide your light under a bushel. I've worked in too many law firms and accounting firms that happens. Now, the last couple of things, Richard, I know you're waving at me, be creative. There was an NED example at the BBC that I had the pleasure of working with them last year. They've got some internal NEDs that they've put onto their boards to get that diversity of thoughts. Then my third and final point, Richard, is what it requires from everybody is bravery, because it's difficult. It is difficult to call out poor behaviours. Give it the energy that it deserves, because it requires your attention every day, and find your tolerance levels and then say 0 tolerance. That's me. I'll shut up.
Awesome, Pauline. We're going to have loads of chance to ask you questions as well towards the end of the session, but I'm going to move straight to Aaron McKenzie, Chief People Officer at Haines Watts. And when he's not talking to us, he's got a lovely Ken Gorm backdrop that he can go walking in as well. Aaron, over to you.
Thank you, Francesca, and hello, everyone. I'd like to build on what Pauline said, and particularly one of her closing points, that everyone needs to be involved to solve the problem of toxic cultures. We may feel that our workplace culture would not lead to the tragic events that unfolded at the Met Police, but even if that's not the case, toxic cultures can and are having a negative well-being consequence for colleagues in many organisations, and are really a major contributor to not attracting and retaining talent at the moment. So for me, the question is, how do we adapt our cultures so they do thrive and they do not orbit around the toxic space? The most important first step is to commit to your people strategy, if not your business strategy, to building a thriving culture. To build a thriving culture, you need actually 2 key ingredients. First, you need to build high levels of colleague engagement in your workplace. And secondly, you need to build high levels of happiness. And you cannot build one without the other. Building high levels of engagement or commitment amongst colleagues to their work without those colleagues being happy will only lead to a burnout situation. And equally, a very happy team without engagement or commitment to the work will simply lead to an unproductive team. So if we assume that you have to put a commitment to building a thriving culture front and center of your strategy, the next question is, how do you build the high levels of engagement and happiness in the workplace that will deliver on that as a strategy outcome? That's when you get into strategy implementation, and that is the hardest part of any strategy program. For me, building engagement in the workplace is the easier of the 2 ingredients to build. There are about a dozen levers at your disposal: the quality of your leadership, the quality of your communication, the effectiveness of your reward framework, to name but a few. But your strategy program should include a systematic approach to either fixing or continuously improving all of those 12 levers. Building happiness in the workplace is, in my experience, the harder journey. We know that there are 4 primary contributors to happiness in the workplace, and those are being recognized for your achievements, career growth, positive relationships, and psychological safety when you talk and speak at work. Of the 4, recognition is possibly the easiest to fix through a good recognition program, and frankly, just saying thank you a lot more. Career growth is perhaps the next easiest, and you can achieve that through good levels of training investment and broader organizational development activities. And we should remember that we are at our happiest when we have a sense of progression at work, or more generally moving forward with our lives. So it really is a critical factor in the happiness index, if you like. The toughest happiness contributors to fix are building positive relationships and building a sense of psychological safety in the workplace. Unlike anything I've said just before now, you cannot typically fix these in a systematic way because both come back to the core values of your organization. As leaders, if you're not consistently nurturing behaviors that shout or signal, to Pauline's point, if they're not signaling, I value teamwork or collaboration, or I value speaking up and there'll be no negative consequences for you, then colleague happiness will actually elude you. So in sum, I would say adapting to a thriving culture is a pretty tough gig, but it is possible. And to Pauline's point, it does need everybody's involvement to be successful.
Fabulous. Thank you very much indeed, Erin. And I think there's quite a few interesting linking themes coming through here. So I'm going to start asking you a few questions that really relate to some of the core topics you mentioned there. And then I'm going to actually ask both of you to answer these because they're not really specific to one of you. But I'm going to pick up with the whole toxic culture piece about how you actually get to the point that you're able to speak out about it, because I think that's one of the most difficult pieces in any organization, but certainly in our professional services sector. Often the poor behaviors are by people who are very up towards the top of the tree, quite senior, or they're the big rainmakers that often people are unwilling to speak out about because they're bringing the most money into the firm. So for both of you, I'd love to get your sense of practical things you've seen about creating a culture where people feel safe, psychologically safe enough to call it out, and how on earth you deal with it, because that's usually the biggest barrier to stopping some of that really egregious toxic behavior at the top of organizations. Maybe Pauline, if I come to you first and then come to Erin, what's your sort of the hot tips on how you might begin to tackle that?
Yeah, so I think for me, this comes back to the word as it pops into my head as you were asking the question. There's trust, and it's who in the organization do we trust, and it doesn't. And you know, I'm an HR professional by background, and not everyone always trusts HR because they think we're there in service of the organization rather than the people. And you know, I was always really conscious of working to break down that barrier. So for me, it's about finding the person that you trust in the organization, whoever it may be. Doesn't have to be HR, doesn't have to be the most senior leader, but who is that person that you know has got the relationships and the connections that you can have that confidential conversation with. Because remember, once something is said, it can't be unsaid, and you've got to be mindful of that. And then it's that network of people that I've always found in any organizations that I've worked. The majority are good, decent human beings, and they want it to be a good place for people to come and work. And it's connecting the dots with those people and getting that criticality of scale and that strength of voice, particularly when it is a board member or a rainmaker. I have found that critical mass of those trusted people, those well-respected other partners within the business, that has helped me when I've come up against really sticky situations and helped overcome it.
Erin, any good tips from you around how you can break that difficulty of calling out the things that need to be called out?
Yeah, and I think the first point that I would make is that if you have to say to your colleagues, I want you to speak up, then you're already in a toxic culture because you've had to give them permission to actually speak up. So if you find yourself in that space, be aware that you've got something to fix. For me, Francesca, it starts with people like yourself as CEOs. The CEO has got to be able to keep people safe when they speak up, even if it's very personal about you, in terms of your own behaviour. Say, for example, and sorry, Francesca, I'm not directing the rest of this to you. But essentially, it starts with the CEO, it starts with the C-suite, and you absolutely have got to reassure people that you are there is not going to be a negative consequence for you if you're saying something that is constructive, that would help the organization move forward from a values or behavior perspective. So as always, it starts with leadership.
Yeah, I think that's so true. I remember being told by someone that the sign of a great organization is the organization that sacks its biggest rainmaker because they're not behaving as they should, and that shows a maturity. Richard.
Yeah, I was reflecting. This sort of was almost McKenzie and Tom Peters. For those of you who don't know the story, Tom Peters some years ago wrote a very successful book called In Search of Excellence, which sold zillions of copies. And of course, he wasn't exactly your typical McKinsey role model, given Tom Peters. And they had quite an interesting choice. They said, well, we could continue to take the $20 million a year, which he was bringing in, which in 1980 is serious money, probably is still today. Or we could say goodbye to our Tom Peters, but in saying keeping Tom Peters, we're actually saying goodbye to our culture. So on balance, I think we will say goodbye to Tom Peters. Very few firms are that brave. Now, I know they've had some problems since, but that's probably a very good example. The one I really wanted to pick up, if I may, Aaron, was this, and I'm an accountant, as you may recall from way back, this notion of a happiness index, I think you mentioned. Now, we've all read about sort of David Cameron trying to create something like that and other people in other countries. Is it something that actually turns people off because it just looks so woolly and iffy? I mean, how practical can you make a happiness index in your experience?
Very practical, actually, Richard. And any organisation that's been going for a number of years will probably be measuring engagement at work. So you will all be familiar with the annual colleague survey, and typically it gives you a result on how engaged. What many organisations fail to do is actually measure happiness as an index in the way that we do engagement. So you can track this. And no, this is not some sort of woolly perspective. There's a lot of science behind the psychology of happiness in the workplace, and it is infinitely measurable, and you can measure your progress in raising happiness levels in the workplace. So no, please don't regard this as a sort of new fad. It is something that if you've got a very good survey provider working with you, you should demand that they measure happiness alongside engagement. And if they don't, switch companies.
I'll pass it back to Francesca.
I think that I think sometimes those people do refer to it as engagement surveys, but there's something intriguing about being open about happiness being something you actually aspire to, as opposed to coat it in another name. Couple of quick ones, really. I mean, Pauline, coming back to you, I love that sort of concept of being very practical, being very pragmatic about the operations piece. When you come to actually defining your operations, publishing those operations, that piece about getting everyone involved, how have you managed to get those more junior levels to actually help drive adaptive culture? I tend to find that the new generation have so many brilliant ideas that we've often overlooked at the senior level. Have you managed to get them involved in defining that adaptive culture?
Yeah, $1 million question, and I think is an ongoing challenge for us. I think what's worked in the past, and again, none of this is groundbreaking. It's a combination of things. So it is through the focus groups that you would pull together to have, when you're doing that, you either do it through the cross section or you have groups of like minds, the more junior population. And there's kind of two schools of thought. If you put the juniors in with the seniors, they'll have a quieter voice. But if you put them all together, they may speak more freely, but it might be a bit less creative. Something I don't know. But my personal view is what I have seen work is actually if you have the more junior people in the room with the more senior people, it's an education piece for the more senior people to get a greater insight to actually just hear what they're thinking, because they can't say that it's not true because it's their person's lived experience, and you can't tell someone they don't think or feel a certain way. It just is what it is. And I think actually generationally, what I love and loathe at the same time, or not loathe, that's a really strong word, frustrated, is the directness and the challenge and the expectation that the younger generations have. And I think, it's a challenge to me when I was in that kind of HRD role is to be challenged constantly, but actually it's a really healthy thing. We look at the basic model of the support and challenge matrix, if we're all in the cozy corner in the top left hand side of, oh, we're all supportive and lovely, but there's no challenge, we're not going to get anywhere. But if we're in the top right hand corner of healthy challenge, healthy support, it's good for the individuals and it's good for the organisation. So I think it's the combination of them being in the room together, having the data, working with a brilliant partner and externally to help you understand that data and what it means. And then for me, because it's ever so my state of mind, is get a list and just start working through it methodically and do what you say you're going to do. Don't go into these things and not be prepared to do something at the end of it.
Yeah, that's such a powerful piece. If you bother to engage with people, let them know at least you've listened. And if you don't do it, why haven't you done it? Yeah, totally agree. And Erin, you mentioned a number of really great ways in which you can help drive up that engagement. And I know you mentioned recognition is in some ways the easiest thing, and yet we do it so badly as a professional service firm. We're brilliant at constructively criticising people, slightly less good at actually recognising the victories. How have you managed to instill that sense of actually remember to thank people? How do you get that instilled into an organisation where we're often very, very poor at it?
Yeah, and it comes back to role modeling behaviours again. And unfortunately, it starts from the topic also, Francesca. Yes, not just you, but
You're just picking on me today, Erin.
Yeah, I'm giving you a hard time. I'm very sorry about that. It does so, but it's just so easy to say thank you. For goodness sake, just get that into the conversation at the end of the email, at the end of the telephone conversation, the Zoom call. Thank you for your contributions, and so on. But yes, recognition frameworks do work really well, I find. And what I find are the very best ones are very democratic recognition frameworks, where yes, you may have some sort of high-level corporate recognition scheme, but actually the ability for people to use a recognition platform to just buzz off thank yous in a more celebratory way than just a note at the foot of the email. So it is about the cultural piece, making a big deal, as well as doing the small things of an acknowledgement of contribution. It's a real huge spectrum of recognition interventions, if you like.
Yeah. Back to you, Richard.
Well, we're sort of coming into the last couple of minutes, and it's just been, as always, a wonderful session. But I'd just like to ask both of you, is there one thing that today's session has kind of given you an insight about? Just talking about your world, is there anything new that's emerged just from the way this conversation's been going? Perhaps, Pauline, anything that immediately springs to mind there?
I don't know if it's new, Richard, but I think it's the positive energy of we can do this and not to just rest on our laurels. And I think, as I said it, and Erin has said it, is we've got to give it attention every day. And I like talking to like-minded people in the sense of wanting to have the energy and the drive to kind of move it forward so that we don't slip back to toxic culture ways. I think that for me is quite energizing.
And anything from your perspective, Erin?
Richard, I'm going to react to your challenge about is happiness just a fad type question, putting words in your mouth. I'm going to re-emphasize the point that actually, everyone, don't forget about happiness. It is the fuel that re-energizes people, and without it, you'll just end up in a burnout situation in your workplace.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both. I think you said telling people you need not giving people permission to call things out, I thought was really helpful insight, Erin. So a lot of people don't realize that in saying it's okay to do it, you're technically actually recognizing that you already have a problem in the first place. I thought that was really helpful insight. And I love the point that Pauline, I know that there's less murder of partners in professional firms than in police forces, but at times you're not always sure. But I thought actually the key word that came out to me was choices. And actually, we do have the choice of how to do things. And all too often, we pretend that we don't. And we say we've got a very collaborative culture because we don't actually make any choices. everybody's very happy, but then you end up with a hippie camp, which doesn't make any money. So I'd like to thank our wonderful audience, and I'd thank panelists today. We'll be back in, I think, in 3 weeks' time, actually, just to be different because of Easter, with another fantastic set of guests. And in the meantime, have a wonderful day, everybody, and great for joining us, and you'll be able to get the videos next week. Bye for now.